In this example, we're going to work our way through the Create Shape form. We're going to look at a series of different vectors and how we can alter the settings within this form to create different shapes. So let's go to File, and we'll just close this down. So we'll go and open an existing file. From the Create Shape Guide project folder, we're going to bring in the Create Shape example.crv3d file. Then we can press Open. And we can see that we have a set of simple vectors that were created in the software. We're going to use these vectors to demonstrate the Create Shape from Vectors tool. So before we do anything, let's just tile our windows horizontally. That way I can see the 2D view at the top and I can see the 3D view at the bottom there. Then we're going to go into the Modeling tab and we're going to go into the Create Shape form. And you can find that under the modelling tools, and it's this first icon here, Create Shape from Vectors. So we'll go in there, and so we're going to start by quickly demonstrating how this feature works. So the first thing you need to do is select a vector that you'd like to create a shape from, and then you're going to go and choose a shape profile. You can choose a curved profile, an angular profile, or look at using the flat profile. We'd then go on to choose various options within the form to control the shape in a little bit more detail, whereby we could look at altering the angle of that shape, we could add in a base height, we could alter the final height of the part, and we are going to run through all of these options as we work our way through this demonstration. And once we've set all of these options, we then need to choose how we combine this component that we're going to create with other components that we may have within our part. So we could choose to add, we could choose to subtract, merge high, or we could look at merging low. And all of these are explained throughout the tutorials, more specifically within the Component Tree Guide tutorial. And then we can go and give the component a name. And it's usually a good idea to name the component what it represents within our design, such as circle, head, wheel, and so on. But it's all dependent on what you are making. So for this example, I'm going to rename this component. We're going to call that Dome. And then I can go ahead and press Apply. And we can see that the software has taken this round 45-degree angle with a height set to no limit, and we can see that it's represented by this yellow shape in the 2D view, and we can see that as a 3D object in the 3D view there. And so if we were happy with that, we'd go ahead there and press Close. And now we can see that we have a component within our component tree, and that's called Dome, as that's the name that we gave it when we created the shape. If I select that, we can see it's now highlighted our grayscale in the 2D view, and it's also highlighted our object within our 3D view there. I can just click in the white space to deselect everything. If I wanted to, I could select our Dome component again using the grayscale, and I can look at moving it. I can also move that in the 3D view, and I can also look at sizing that up and changing the shape, and I can also do that in the 2D view as well. So I'm just going to go and delete this component. So we'll right mouse click on our component here, and then we're going to go and use the option to delete that. You can see it's been removed from our component tree. We no longer have a grayscale, and we no longer have a component within our 3D view there. So now we're going to look at some of the other options that we can use within the Create Shape form. So let's go over to Create Shape from Vectors, and I'm going to reselect that circle vector that we selected earlier. So the normal process that we're going to use is to select one vector and then create a shape from that vector. Okay, so we're just going to apply that, and then we're going to go and select Start New Component, and then we can see that the grayscale has been deselected, and we can now go and select another vector. We can go and give that an angled profile if we wanted, press Apply there, and then we can go and start a new component, and then we'll go and select this vector over here, give that a round profile, and then press Apply. And then so we'll just work through to create a set of components that we can individually edit after we've used the Create Shape tool. So now I'd like to show you how the different choices that we make within the form will react with different types of vector outlines. So if we just close this form down, going to select this component, hold down Shift, select this grayscale, and then still holding down Shift, I'm going to select this one here, and then I'm going to right mouse click and we're going to use the option to delete them. So let's just go back into the Create Shape form, and this time I'm going to select all the vectors, and so we'll be working through the form and creating a single component each time that just happens to be in 5 single outlines. Now this isn't really the way that would normally work, but this will help demonstrate all of the different shapes and the different choices that we make within the form on different shape vectors. So we're going to start by looking at the curved profile, and we're going to look at the effects of adjusting the angle within that shape. So we'll just go with the 45-degree angle, and we'll just apply that for the time being. I'm just going to tilt that and just zoom out a little so we can see that a little bit better in the 3D view there. If I wanted to, I could change the angle by typing in a specific value, so I could put in 60 there and apply that, and we can see those changes have been made. If we're not sure on a value to put in for the angle, then we could just look at using the slider here. And then we can see that the model's being updated instantly within the 3D view. We can also go down into negative values to create a shape that's going to go down from the modeling plane. And take a look at that, and then we can pull that back up again. And if I wanted to, I could go and change the profile, so we'll make that an angular profile. We could make the angle of that 30 degrees and apply that in there. We can see these changes being made here, and again I could go and use the slider if I wanted to move that up. And it's also worth noting that if you pull the slider all the way up to 90, then the software is going to go to the default middle settings here, as it's not possible to have an angle of 90 degrees, as that would be a vertical edge. So just going to pull that down to low angles there, and we can see how these shapes are being created here in the 3D view. And again, we could go down and create negative shapes if we wanted, and then pull those back up. Another option we could use is the flat profile. And so we can see that the angle selection here has been greyed out, and that's because it has no effect on the flat profile, as we use this to create flat shapes. And all we do in this particular shape is just give that a vertical height, and we can do that by inputting a value within the base height here, or we could look at using the slider. For example, if I wanted to create a flat shape of 1/4 of an inch, I could go in and type in 0.25, and then I'm going to apply that, and then I can see that I have a vertical edge coming up to 0.25. A useful thing to note here is that at the bottom of my 3D view here in this area, wherever I move my mouse, it's telling my X and Y positions of where that cursor is. Now if I hover over my model, or any model that I have within my 3D view, it will tell me the Z value. We can see that there's a Z value there of 1/4 of an inch, and that's because we set that base height to be 1/4 of an inch there. Now the base height doesn't just control the flat profile, we can use it in a combination with other shape profiles. So if we just make the base height back to 0, then we'll just pop that back in the Z view there. So let's go back to the curved profile, and we'll give that an angle of 40 degrees, and we'll just press apply there. And so we have a curved shape of 40 degrees between each one of our vectors. But if we look at adding in a small base height of, say, 1/8 of an inch, so put 0.125 in there, and then press apply, you can look, we now have our 40-degree dome that's sat on top of a vertical edge of 0.125, or 1/8 of an inch there. Okay, so let's just reset that base height back to 0, and then press apply there, pop that back in Z. So let's go and alter the angle of that. We're going to make that 60 and press apply. And then if we have a look at each of our shapes, the height that it reaches is based on the width of the shape. So when we create a shape, all we're doing is applying a profile to the space within our vector. And so the wider something is, like our dome here, the profile will be stretched all the way across. And the smaller the width of a vector means that the shape has less space to stretch across, so the resulting height will be smaller. And we can see that shown in this shape here. So if we just zoom in there, and if we take a look at the bottom area here, when I move my cursor over the top of this shape here, we can see that the Z height is around 0.35, and remember this is the wider area here. And then as I move that cursor down where the shape is getting narrower, we can see that the Z height is getting smaller. So we can see there it's at around 0.19. And so this is a very important concept to understand, as we have the final height set to no limit over here. It's just going to use the width of the vector and the angle that we set the shape to create the shape. But we do have options to control the shape height, and we can do that by using the limit to height, or we could look at using the scale to height there. So if I just pop that in Z, we're going to look at this option, limit to height. And so this option will allow me to specify a height that I'd like to limit the shape of our component. And we can do that either by putting in a specific value, or we could look at using the slider. So if I change the value of this to be 0.05 and then press apply in there, and we can see, if we just take a look and zoom in there, we can see that it's still using this rounded profile at this angle of 60 degrees. But what we've done is we've told the software that as soon as it gets to this height of 0.05, we want that to flatten off. And then we could look at increasing that. So if I just increase that slowly, and I'll just zoom out there so we can see that a little bit better. And we can see that we can constantly change the height that we want to limit that to. We can keep going up, and you'll notice now that the T isn't changing. And that's because no part of that T shape gets up to this value of 0.3225. And so what it's done, it's gone back to its standard round shape as defined at the top here. Whereas some of these other shapes that we've got here are getting to heights which have more value than the 0.3225, and so they're still being flattened off. And so we would continue sliding the height up to a value that's actually larger than any of the shapes that we have defined, and then we'll see that none of them have been affected by the limit to height option because it's not reaching that height to limit. And so that's a nice way to control the height of our shapes, but it does affect our profile by actually adding in that flat area on top of each of our objects. Another option we can use is the scale to an exact height rather than use the limit to height. And what that will do, it will just scale the highest point to the value that we specify. So if we use the scale to an exact height and then put in a value of, say, 1/2 inch, then we'll just go and apply that. What that's going to do, as I mentioned, it's going to scale the highest point to 1/2 inch. And we've already worked out that the highest point of our component is going to be the peak of our dome because that's the widest area. And so if I hover over the top of our dome here, if I just pop that in Z, we can see that it is at 0.5 there. And everything else will be scaled proportionally. So we normally work with one vector at a time. So if we just go and reset this, and then I'm just going to click into the white space, as I'd just like to select one vector. So we're going to go and select our circle vector. And so we'll go with the settings that we've got here, a curve profile, a 60-degree angle. We're going to scale that to 1/2 inch, and then we'll go and press apply. Okay, so we know that is at 1/2 inch at its highest point there. We'll then go and start a new component. We'll go and select this rectangle vector over here. This time I'd like to give that an angled profile, and I'm going to scale that to an exact height of 1/4 inch. We'll press apply there, and then if we take a look at that, we can see in the bottom area here that that's scaled up to an exact height of 0.25. So then I'm going to go and start a new component, and then we'll go and select this vector over here. Give that a round profile. This time I'm going to reduce the angle and we'll make that 40. This time we're going to scale that to an exact height of 3/4 inch. We'll press apply there, and we can see that the highest point of that component is at 3/4 of an inch. So we can see that each individual shape I can specify the values precisely to define it so that I can make it look exactly as I want it to. So then we'll go on to our next vector. I'm going to select that there, and then we can see that we've actually lost the component that we just created, and that's because I didn't use this option to start a new component. And so if we wanted to keep that shape, then I'd go and select that vector. It's remembered the settings that we just used. Then we can press apply, and then we'll go and start a new component, and then we can select our new vector there. And this one, I'd like to give that an angled profile this time. I'm going to make my angle 30 degrees. I'm also going to apply a base height here of 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm also going to scale that to an exact height of 1/4 of an inch there. So we'll apply that, and we can see that we have that vertical height coming up to 1/4 of an inch, and then we have a shape on top that's scaled its highest point to 1/4 of an inch. And so you'll notice that we have a total Z height of 0.5, and that's because it's combined the base height with the height that we've scaled that to. And so we'll go and start a new component. So then we'll go and select that T vector over here. I'm going to go with an angled profile. This time I'm going to put in an angle of 45. We'll give that a base height of 0.1. And this time I'd like to limit the height of that to be at 0.1. And then we'll go ahead and press apply. We can see that we have a chamfered effect there. So if I just zoom in, we can see that we have that vertical base height there going up to 0.1, and then we're limiting the height of the shape to 0.1, and so we have a combined total of 0.2. Okay, so let's just pop that in Z for the moment, and then we'll close that down, and we can see all of those components that we've just created are sat within our component tree there. And I can click on them in the 2D view or the 3D view, or look at clicking them on the component tree, and then we can look at working on them some more to edit them using the component editing tools. Now there's one more feature in the Create Shape tool that we haven't looked at, so I'm just going to delete everything. To do that, I'm going to select them all in the component tree by holding down Shift. I'm going to right mouse click and use the option to delete. So I'm going to go and select this circle here. I'm going to select it again to put it into transform mode. I'm going to hold down Shift, and then I'm just going to move that over to the right, and holding down Shift just allows me to keep it in line. Okay, so now it's overlapping our rectangle shape here. So we're going to go back into the Create Shape from Vectors form. I'm going to go and select my rectangle vector. I'm going to give that a round profile of 30 degrees, and then I'm going to set the final height of that to have no limit. We'll press apply. We can see that's made those changes there in the 3D view. Then I'm going to go and start a new component, and then I'm going to select this circle here. I'm going to go with a round profile. Again, I'm going to go with the same settings as the rectangle, so we'll go with 30 degrees, no limit, press apply there. And so we can see in the 3D view that where they overlap, they're being added together. So we need to go over and alter the combine mode. So we're going to change that combine mode to merge, so that now that it's blending into our rectangle shape. And in a number of cases, you may want to create a component where one is in front of another. And in this example, I want our circle to appear as though it's in front of our rectangle. And to do that, we can use this option over here to apply a tilt. And what that does, it creates an angled plane similar to the base height, but we can control it by selecting the areas that we want to raise up rather than raise up the whole shape. And so the area that I'd like to lift up is the right hand side here. So we'll go and check the tilt option. The next thing we need to do is set our anchor point, or the area that we'd like to stay on the modelling plane. Then we're going to use the option to set. Okay, so we just click in place where you'd like the part to lift up from. So we're going to go from this point here from the left, and you can see that's dragged out this cursor here. and I'd like to tilt the right hand side up, so I'm going to click on the right hand side, and we can see it's automatically done that for me, and we can see now that our circle is completely proud of our rectangle here. And so if we just tilt our view there, we can see how this has worked. So it's applied quite a large wedge underneath our shape there, and that wedge is at an angle of 10 degrees, and we can look at altering this using the slider, so we can make that bigger if we wanted to, or we could look at decreasing that, or we could even type in a value and apply that to see how that looks. Okay, and so we can see that using the tilt option we can create the look that one component is in front of another. Another function of the tilt would be just to create an angled shape. If we combined it by just using the flat profile and the tilt, then we could look at creating a flat wedge shape. For some applications, this could be a shape that you actually want to make. So I'm happy with that, so let's just close down that form. And so we can see our components within our component tree along with the combine modes that we set in that form. Now it's important to note that the component that we create in the form is not connected to the vector that we have in the 2D view. For instance, if I select this component here and just drag that out, we can see that the vector just stays in the same place. And the only time that there is a connection with the vector and the shape is when we hit the apply button in the form in order for the software to create the component. After that, there is absolutely no connection between the two. There is one thing a vector will remember, and that's the parameters that we use within the create shape form if that vector has been used to make a component. So if we go into the create shape from vectors form and select that circle vector, you'll see it's remembered we used a curved profile of 30 degrees, no limit, and it's got that tilt with the angle that we set it on there. I can work through the other vectors and we can see that all of the values have been remembered there. And that memory will also remember if you copied a vector you created a shape from one session of Aspire to another. So let's just close that down. And so that completes this tutorial where we've looked at all the various options we can use within the create shape form in order for us to create components.